and long and often frigid. But winters here are anticipated, welcomed. All the wonders of their harshness create a special season in which these robust Americans take great delight. Winter here, in fact, has a life of its own. One that reflects the spirit of a community remarkable for its self-reliance and historical achievement. And of all that glowing heritage that distinguishes this small Northwood city, one legacy emits on Sunday afternoons, a radiance equal to that of any metropolitan giant.
Of Green Bay Packers, the Grandstand franchise, is made possible in part by grants from Aid Association for Lutherans, providing insurance and other fraternal benefits with headquarters in Appleton, Wisconsin. And from Kellogg Bank, Green Bay, Wisconsin, providing professional banking services for over a century.
It seems that the Green Bay people can only remember 1959 when Lombardi came up there. And the professional football was long established before those fellows came along, you know. But Lambeau is the real hero of the Green Bay Packers.
I think you've got to give credit to Lambeau. I think he did a hell of a job. I think you've got to give credit to the people that was running the ball club. And most of all, you've got to give credit to the fans.
And so in the late 40s, the team started losing for the first time under Lambeau. I remember in 1948, we were 3-9, and the next year we were 2-10, and those are the last 2 years that Curly was with the Packers as head coach.
And I think when the Green Bay went down, they had very poor management. When they went up, best case is Lombardi.
So what we needed was some direction and leadership, and that's the foremost thing that he brought to us. He brought organization, he brought a thorough knowledge of the game, obviously, and he gave us direction and leadership, and we badly needed it.
He not only helped the Green Bay Packers, he helped the league. He set standards in dress, he set standards in style, he set standards in play that I think everybody, maybe even to this day, in some small way, are trying to, you know, keep up.
We're the little town that supports a big football team that goes and plays all the other big teams from the metropolitan areas and do pretty darn good, and people like that. They like to see that.
The interrelation between the fan and the community is something to behold. My wife tells me that she has a great time just going to the supermarket because she can get out amongst people and talk about the game.
This multi-million-dollar corporation known as the Green Bay Packers. And in fact, I one time asked Curly about that. I said, Curly, did you ever envision this happening? He said, no, heck no. He said, I just wanted to play football.
Hello, I'm Ray Scott. I'm surrounded by a shrine unique in the world of sport. A hall of fame dedicated to the deeds and legends of a single professional football team, the Green Bay Packers. Of course, it's fitting that it is unique because there's no franchise in any city in all of the world comparable to the one created, hallowed, and nourished in this Wisconsin community. If this is your first stop in Packerland, you have to wonder in going from display to display, what is this community called Green Bay, Wisconsin? Well, surrounding the Hall of Fame is an outdoor playground, clad today for the winter fun we saw before. Here, redressed for equal gusto in the resort climate that is summer. And then, as it's painted in natural splendor, while each season dissolves into its counterpart. An international seaport connects Green Bay to the industrial hubs of the world. Giant paper mills, born of the region's ancestral logging industry, are more concentrated along the Fox River than anywhere else in the world, and they turn out a greater variety of paper products than any state in the Union. Cheese making, of course, and meat packing and agricultural commerce have always brought widespread recognition to the area. And the foundation upon which all of this enterprise was achieved is an intensely dedicated and proud people. Generations descending from Irish, Belgian, Danish, Dutch, German, and Polish immigrants living in a city and adjoining townships titled after early French explorers and the Native Americans who met them. These people, past and present, are the source of the legend that has become Green Bay, Wisconsin. Their spirit built this Hall of Fame and is enshrined here with their gridiron heroes. But that spirit is enshrined far more poignantly in the story of how all this and a team called the Packers came to be. When the Packers were born, men named Rockney and Warner and Yost and Stagg were just beginning to make football a national collegiate spectacle. The professional version, though, was at best a poor relation. Then, on September 17th of 1920, the American Professional Football Association was created. The Packers joined a year later, and in 1922, it became the National Football League. And the history of the NFL is in many ways the history of what happened in Green Bay. It's a history that saw even the mightiest of teams in a constant struggle with solvency and often losing. Many colorful and storied names fell sadly into football obscurity. Only 3 of the 1921 franchise holders were able to survive: the Packers in Green Bay and the teams that later became the Chicago Bears and the St. Louis Cardinals. Wisconsin's oldest city remains today the NFL's oldest one franchise member. What Green Bay contributed to professional football, though, the league returned in kind. National attention to Packer football could never have been sustained had not the NFL banded together in the 1930s to forge a friendly bond with the nation's colleges and create a college player draft that would balance the league's talent. Equally important was the implementation of the league's policy for sharing all television revenues and the mergers it enacted with the All-America Conference in 1950 and the American Football League in the mid-1960s. One of the forces that gave birth to the Packers in 1919 was common throughout towns in Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Upper New York. A growing fascination with gridiron teams carrying the banner of civic pride into Sunday afternoon shootouts called professional football. But in this rugged city at the upper edge of the Fox River Valley, there were 3 additional forces that were to make their Packers a sports world and social phenomenon. The first was an imaginative, enthusiastic young athlete named Earl Louis Lambeau. The second was a profanity-prone, cigar-chewing, tenacious sports editor of the Green Bay Press-Gazette, George Whitney Calhoun. The third force, and the most lasting, was a fiercely proud community that would dedicate itself everlastingly to the support of the valiant athletes who represented Green Bay.
Curly, you know, had played 1 season at Notre Dame. He made the varsity team at fullback under Newt Rockney his freshman year, which gives you some idea of his versatility, you know.
Badly infected tonsils interrupted his college education just after that season closed. An ensuing $250 a month job back in his hometown of Green Bay made the education seem unnecessary. Then came the smells and breezes that signaled the arrival of the autumn of 1919.
Said, I sure would like to play football, but I hate to quit my job. I'm making $250 a month, and he felt, of course, he told me one time he felt that was as much money as there was in the world, and he was, of course, only 19 years old.
After a glory-filled 4 years as a triple-threat high school back and a season with the Fighting Irish, Lambeau found himself in an unexpected and depressing circumstance. It was a problem, though, that he was fortunately able to discuss with a highly influential confidant, the sports editor, whose friendship he'd earned during his high school career. This was George Whitney Calhoun of the Green Bay Press-Gazette, whose own career had been frustratingly abbreviated by juvenile arthritis.
Calhoun said, well, why don't I just put a notice in the paper and ask for people to show up and to sign up for the football team and see what kind of response you get.
In fact, Cal wrote a story in the paper and calling for a meeting of, of players that were interested, and he actually listed a number of the players, said, and intimated that they better report.
Seeds were sown for the town team that would create Titletown, USA. On August 15, 1919, Cal wrote in the Press Gazette, close to 25 pigskin chasers attended the conference last evening, and there was a great deal of enthusiasm displayed among the candidates. Indications point to having the greatest team in the history of football in Green Bay, and there's no doubt but that Gridiron fans will see a great exhibition at Hagemeister Park this fall. Cal had provided the publicity and was elected team manager. Lambeau had his roster and the title of team captain. The only missing items, a name and uniforms, were to be forever linked in football legend.
You had your own headgear, your own pants, your own shoes. You bought your shoes. And they were very different colored socks and different colored pants and different colored hip pads. You bought everything but your jerseys, but that's the way you played.
Lambeau convinced his boss at the Indian Packing Company that donating the money to outfit the Green Bay squad would be good public relations. So in that first year, the team took to the playing field wearing new blue shirts and calling themselves, appropriately, the Packers. The Indian Packing Company itself was gone nearly before that season's end. The blue jerseys were later changed to green. But the name Packers would go on to become synonymous with professional football and to personify the word excellence in sporting competition. The first step toward that glorious future was taken here in that autumn of 1919. This complex was then a vacant lot called Hagemeister Park. With the gridiron etched in lime at its center, it was the Packers' home field for their first 3 seasons. During 1923 and 1924, while the old park was being transformed into today's East High School and the field that would become City Stadium, the team played their home games here. The old Hagemeister office building, after a number of remodelings, is still in use here today at what was, in 1923, the end of Main Street. Over there, a canopied baseball grandstand surrounded New Bellevue Park. Playing 2 seasons here, before a background that was the Hagemeister's Bellevue Products Building, the Packers regularly drew crowds of 4,000 and 5,000 fans, as well as complaints about the inadequate seating arrangements for viewing football and the fact that the location was on the edge of town. So the community added a new field and grandstands to the East High construction work. In 1925, the Packers were back near their original home, playing before constantly expanding grandstands on turf that was considered the league's finest playing surface for the next 20 years. This was Green Bay's City Stadium. Along with Milwaukee's State Fair Park and County Stadium, it was the home of the Packers until 1957. They carried on here the success born at Hagemeister and Bellevue Parks and went on to 3 world championships before fielding a team that lost more games than it won. And that year, 1933, stood by itself in the midst of Green Bay's first 29 years of Major League professional football. Lambeau moved from team captain to player coach, and after the 1929 season to coach and general manager. While Calhoun's efforts in publicity kept the Packers in the news, Lambeau's skill at finding football talent and getting the most out of it brought tiny Green Bay into the national sports spotlight. The first breakthrough came in 1928, when the upstart Wisconsinites had the audacity to take on New York's Giants in the Polo Grounds and return home with a 13-0 victory. Big Apple skeptics and the rest of the National Football League were given due notice that, to paraphrase the old saying, it's not the size of the town in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the town's team. And the very next year, Green Bay's Fighting Packers went through every opponent in the league without a defeat and brought home their first world championship. Teams would capture 5 more world titles in 1930, 31, 36, 39, and 44, a total of 6.
Well, of course, I think that what Curly Lambeau did was a much more significant accomplishment than what Hallis did with the Decatur Staley's when he took them to the Chicago. Lambeau had a dream, and he accomplished it. He manifested it.
Fundamentally, he may not have been the finest coach in the world, but he was a motivator and one of the best, and he was a very offensive-minded coach. He put in a lot of offensive plays that people had never seen before.
Was that he was a pioneer of the forward pass in professional football. You know, back in the 20s, he was throwing the ball 20 and 25 and 30 times a game long before any other team even thought of really throwing the football.
I think his biggest asset, and I think John will probably agree with me, his biggest asset was that he knew how to pick football players. And he brought in a lot of players that was good football players, and he didn't really have to coach them a lot.
He could let you alone, and he'd get what you could do and do well. But he knew how to pick talent, and he knew how to get that out of talent that was there. That was his one quality, I think, that superseded everything else, even though he wasn't a great coach.
And he was a real inspirational guy, and he demanded a lot. And we respect him, and he got a lot out of us.
He believed in pep talks. And he would inspire us before to go out in the field. He'd have us jumping through the windows and everything else, and I ate it up, you know. I was ready to kill people.
They ran a play in the middle of the line, and the whole bunch of us ganged in to stop them, and I felt somebody grabbing my arm and trying to get me out of the pileup. I was down on the bottom of it. I don't necessarily say I made the tackle. I don't know who made the tackle, but I look up, and it's Curly. He done come off the bench and was in there trying to separate us, see whether they scored or not.
He was a very fine coach, I think, during the week, but on Sunday, you just well forget he was there, because he absolutely was just, he didn't know what was happening, you know, really. He was such a high-strung person.
One thing that I always admired about Lambeau, he didn't pay us an awful lot of money. I mean, it was an argument every season with him. But when we traveled on the road, we would leave Green Bay in 2 Pullmans and a dining car of our own. He would keep us in the best hotels, and he tried to project an image of pro football as the players being gentlemanly, you know, and he did that, and we traveled first class, and he was the first to have blazers made for all of us, green blazers, and he was the first pro team to fly to a football game. He was a great organizer, too. He was one of the first to come out with playbooks. And I think he was as great a coach. I don't think he gets enough credit in Green Bay for what he did.
Even during the 20s, you know, he was being in the early 30s, he was being introduced to New York like the big stars of other sports like Babe Ruth and Bill Tilden, the great tennis player, Jack Dempsey. Curly was in that same, you know, pantheon at that time, and so he had already by the late 30s, he had been used to great success and great visibility throughout the nation, not only in Green Bay and the Midwest.
The 3 consecutive championships in 1929, 30, and 31 remained unequaled in NFL record books until another Packer team in another distant era rose up to match it. The athletes who dominated those Packer teams have grown to immortality in Green Bay and in the NFL. Giants like Cub Buck, Baby Ray, Jug Earp, and Cal Hubbard. Fierce, versatile competitors led by Iron Mike Michalski, Clark Hinkle, Buckets Goldenberg, and Charlie Brock. Talented runners, kickers, passers, and receivers such as Johnny Blood McNally, Vern Llewellyn, Lavi Dilweg, Arnie Herber, Cecil Bell, Ted Fritsch, Tony Canadeo, and the incomparable Don Hutson.
The tremendous impact that man had on the Green Bay Packers and professional football. He was the one who, of course, pioneered pass patterns. He still ranks in the National Football League records as a top receiver of all time as far as touchdowns are scored. He had 99 touchdowns in 11 seasons, and no player since then. He's been retired now for 36 years, and no player has yet been able to match that performance.
Don, the greatest offensive end that ever lived, bar none. Bar none.
I don't know, right now Lofton might catch him, but I doubt it. Hutson was a great athlete also, as Lofton's a great athlete. But Hutson played defense. You know, a lot of people forget that. He not only played offense, but he had to go back and play defense.
Don would go back and play defensive halfback. And that's what made Don so valuable as a defensive halfback, because he had speed, super quicks, real smart.
If they can sprint and jump and carry the ball, that they are the ideal receivers. So we now hear about ideal receivers, of which I think it's fair to say Green Bay had the first two that played together. Don Hutson and a guy McNally.
Johnny was Sim Hutson. He could do the 100 under 10 seconds. He had great moves. It was uncanny how he would get in a crowd of defenders and for some unknown reason come up with that football all the time. And he was the same type of football player as Don Hutson. As far as the fundamentals of football, the blocking and tackling, Johnny wasn't too adept at that.
He was a type of a ball player, probably something like Paul Hornung.
Yeah.
He was a Sunday football player.
Yeah.
He could do a lot of things that other athletes couldn't do on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and still go out and play a terrific football game on Sunday.
Well, on Charlie, he was he was the punter on the team at that time.
Sure.
He was a damn good passer and probably one of the best pass catchers, receivers, next to Hutson, maybe.
Well, it's due to the length of time I'm going to have on this program. I don't think I can start on McNally. You should have a serial about him running once a week for an hour.
They'd say, yeah, he can play. He plays ball all right, but he'll lose your games as well as win them. And so my answer to that was, well, just name me one game I lost. I've never found anybody that had an answer to that.
There were three players that came from the old New York Yankees.
Right.
Cal Hubbard, Bo Melenda.
Oh, Mike Machowski.
And Mike Machowski.
Mike Machowski, yeah.
Machowski had been a fullback, and he became a guard, and a magnificent one.
If you were a football fan, you enjoyed it extremely, just watching him perform at guard.
And he was one of the first. He was red dogging and blitzing back in 1933 and 34, so there's nothing new in football, really. And Mike was, he was cagey. He was always thinking one play ahead.
I think Clark Hinkle was one of the greatest fullbacks there is in football. It was between Nagurski and Hinkle, and every time they met, Hinkle got the best of them.
The thing that we used to use to get Hink to play his best game was to remind him that Nagurski had been the all-pro fullback the year before. And he went out like a wild man. But in several years, he was the all-pro fullback. And when Nagurski played fullback and you were all-pro ahead of him, what else can you say?
He was just a tough monkey. And he was willing to engage anybody in battle. And
Clark was a tough guy. I think Clark was the best football player that ever was here. And that includes a lot of them. Well, Clark could back the line. He could carry the ball. He could block. He could punt. He could pass. He could kick off. He could go down on kickoffs. Now, what the hell else can a man do?
Buckets Goldenberg ought to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I mean, if there was ever a guy that gave 300%, it was Buckets Goldenberg, and not only defensively, but offensively. And he was a chip off the old block of Mike Machowski. And
great football play. One of the most fierce competitors I ever seen. I remember when I came to Green Bay, he had a little, he was going to play the Bears, I believe my first or second year here, and he had a little sprained knee. And I said, Buckets, are you going to be able to play against the Bears? He said, I may have to play out of a wheelbarrow, but I'm going to play.
I inherited the name Buckets. My brother played high school football, and the coach always had to remind him to pull his fanny in. And he'd be yelling, pull in your buckets, Bucket. And so everybody called him Buckets. And when I started, I didn't look for the nickname. It was there.
Buckets didn't come to the Packers as a guard.
Came as a fullback.
Now, I never knew that. How about your memory, Andy, of Buckets as a player?
Well, he was great. He was about 240, I guess, wasn't he, Tony?
Yes.
And he was short, and he made a lot of tackles.
A good offensive guard pulling out, and he had a great feud going with Danny Fortman of the Chicago Bears throughout the years.
He was a great competitor. He was all football.
I think Cecil Isbell was just a little bit ahead of his time. Now, I think Cecil Isbell could have been a great T formation quarterback because he had great knack of getting to the receiver and leading a receiver. And without the running, Cecil was never one that liked to run because of that shoulder injury he had in college. And I think he'd have been a great T formation quarterback.
He played with a harness quite a lot.
When he first came up, yes.
Yeah, I played a couple years with Cease, and in my book, he ranks right alongside of Sid Luckman and Sammy Baugh. He had a nice soft pass. He was a pinpoint passer, and he could pass to the spot. And not only that, he was an adequate punter when you needed him. And being in that tailback again, he could run with the ball, but he was a beautiful passer.
All right, now how about, let's go to Charlie Brock. Did you play with Charlie?
Yes, I played with Charlie. I played against him in college, and I played with him here in Green Bay. And Charlie was a great center, great defensive man. They used to call him the thief because he used to steal so many balls. And like Sonny said out there, he made 28 points in the season. That's pretty hard for a center.
We were playing in Chicago, playing the Chicago Cardinals, and we had to win that game to get in the playoffs in the championship. And we were getting beat. So I'm on the sidelines, and Lambeau called me off the bench, and he says, you go in there and get that ball, and he says, I don't care how you get it, you steal it if you have to steal it. And, you know, being coached under Lambeau, you did what he told you to do.
As an offensive center, he never made a bad pass.
I don't think you could find a better football player than Charlie Brock. Defensively and offensively.
Arnie Herber, it was his second year. He was a local boy from Green Bay, and he stood about 5'11", weighed 205 pounds, and I was very much impressed with him my first year. And he was probably the most accurate long passer that ever played football.
Yeah, and you know, in them days the ball was like a pumpkin, and they mostly used to palm it, but he used to throw them 70, 80 yards.
He could throw a ball the length of the field. But the unique thing about Arnie, as far as I'm concerned, is he could take more punishment than any man I've ever seen and come up laughing.
After we'd won the championship, we were out in California playing a few exhibition games. And they made this movie about the Green Bay Packers. And when we went out on the movie set one day, they had hung up a pane of glass 3 feet square on the goalpost. And they gave Herber the ball at the 50-yard line and told him to throw it through the glass. Now, this was a Hollywood idea of accuracy in throwing the ball. Well, they thought he'd be there a week, you know, and they'd just keep taking the shot until he hit one. He threw the first two right through the glass from 50 yards. Now, that's accuracy with football.
Colorful, proud, skillful, unique individuals who gave to professional football a personality and spirit without which the sport would have died in obscurity.
The only reason 90% of them played football is because they liked it. That's the only reason. I could make more money driving a truck than I could playing football.
This $3,300 that I signed for sounds like an absolute joke. Now, isn't that ridiculous?
I have no complaints about the 18 years I spent at it. I got my emotional income's worth. I got that I wouldn't have got any other way at any other time. It just fitted my style.
And just as they are representative of the kind of individuals it took to breathe first life into what has since become an entertainment giant, so the Green Bay community and these men are representative of the kind of dedication it took to make a place for that life. They were known around Green Bay as the Hungry Five because it seemed they were forever begging yet another dollar on behalf of the beloved Packers. So while Green Bay was by no means immune to the financial woes that proved fatal to Canton and Rochester and Hammond and all their other fallen adversaries, they did have a distinct advantage. They had the Hungry Five to work with the indomitable Lambeau in keeping the wolf from the door and the team on the field. During the team's first 3 years, though, financial and all other matters were left solely in the hands of Lambeau and Calhoun. Publicity was Cal's first priority, of course, drumming up as large a crowd of spectators as he could. He also passed a hat for contributions at Hagemeister Park before a fence was put up to control attendance. Later, he manned the gate, selling tickets and carefully counting heads. When Lambeau saw in 1921 the importance of buying into the year-old American Professional Football Association, he went for financial backing where he had gone for help 2 years earlier, to his boss. So on August 27th of that year, Mr. J.E. Clare of the Acme Packing Company was granted, for a fee of $100, a franchise for a team to play in the new league. But this was not the casual organization nominally headed the year before by Jim Thorpe. Now, George Halas was on the scene, and there were new rules to be followed if the fledgling league was to gain respect and credibility. One such rule prohibited the use of college players still in school, and Curley was one of its first violators. As a warning to other teams and other coaches, the league confiscated Green Bay's franchise and demanded an apology from Lambeau and an additional $250 for a new franchise. Again, Curley had to seek out financial help, and again he found it, this time in a friend named Don Murphy. Murphy, a non-athlete, sold his Marmon Roadster to raise the cash necessary to obtain the new franchise in return for Curley's promise to put him in Green Bay's starting lineup for the team's season opener in the NFL. Lambeau kept his promise. When the Packers kicked off to the Duluth Eskimos in 1922, 10 players went for the ball carrier, and one, Murphy, for the safety of the sideline. For that one season, Green Bay's professional football franchise was the sole property of Earl Louis Lambeau. But the purchase of uniforms and franchises proved to be minor obstacles before that season came to a close. This was a major professional league the Packers were playing in now. The $16 per season Curley paid his players in 1919 was out of the question. Yearly, competitive salaries and visiting teams' profits had to be both attractive and guaranteed. The sums involved seem meager today. Even such sought-after stars as Cub Buck and Jug Earp earned no more than $100 a game. But to an organization that had no formal financial structure, such costs were astronomical. And at the end of the 1922 season, the Packers found themselves preparing for their final game with little hope of being able to pay the visiting Duluth Eskimos their guarantee. The kind of help Curley needed was beyond what bosses and buddies could lend. Calhoun's buoyant publicity efforts and his dogged attention to gate receipts were both annulled by a disastrous and costly rainout. But Cal had a boss too, Andrew Turnbull, business manager of the Press-Gazette. He heard Lambeau in Cal's office as the two discussed a plan to cancel the Eskimo game in order to avoid liability for the contracted payment. Knowing how devastating such a tactic would be to Green Bay's hopes of gaining respect as a professional football city, Turnbull advanced the team the necessary funds to pay off the Eskimos. He also promised to rally the Green Bay business community to the aid of the poverty-prone Packers. Turnbull and Calhoun thus began their tenure as the first two of the Hungry Five. The next summer, they were joined by the remaining complement, as well as by many other civic leaders, in forming a corporation still unprecedented in professional sports. To raise operating revenue, it sold stock to interested investors at the reasonable rate of $5 per share. But to be eligible, purchasers first had to buy at least 6 1923 Packer season tickets. What's more, it was non-profit stock that would never even pay back its original cost. And if the corporation were to disperse for any reason, all its assets would become the property of the American Legion. The only return stockholders could ever possibly realize would be in glory reflected from the gridiron exploits of the valiant athletes who represented Green Bay. In all, it was more a measure of community pride than a stock sale, and not surprisingly, the Hungry Five found all the investors they needed. Franchise ownership was thus passed to the brand new Green Bay Football Corporation. 15-member board of directors was elected by the shareholders, and that board in turn elected an executive committee to manage the team's operations. That structure is still intact today. The new organization not only put the Packers back into action in 1923, it also gave Curly Lambeau the resources necessary to scout the country for the football talent that would lead them to national prominence. Even with their unparalleled success, though, the Packers were headed into the teeth of what was to become the Great Depression. It wasn't all that surprising then to find at the end of the 1934 season that events had once again brought the team to the brink of financial collapse. The corporation was forced into receivership. It needed cash, and it needed reorganization. This time, it was the Hungry Five's Lee Joannis who came to the rescue with a personal $6,000 loan. He then spearheaded a new fundraising drive through the formation and sale of stock in the Green Bay Packers Incorporated, a new organization, but one that carried over the original nonprofit provisions and simply restated the 1923 articles in expanded terms. That effort repaid the loan and once again created a solvent franchise. The next crisis came as the century was reaching its midpoint. Lambeau had always been a showman and always flamboyant. Curly had also always been nearly in complete control of Packer operations, even after the advent of the corporate structure. And during the 1940s, shareholders, board of directors, and executive committee notwithstanding, that flamboyance and that control led him and the team he had created into the first of what would grow into a painful series of difficult problems. $40,000 was allocated for the purchase of an elaborate training facility 15 miles north of Green Bay called Rockwood Lodge. It was impressive, to be sure. It also proved hopelessly impractical.
It was a bad situation because there was no place to practice. The rocks kept coming up through. And so I went to him. We all had to eat breakfast together. We had to stay together and everything else out there. I said, Curly, if we don't get off of this field out here, we're going to have some football players that are not going to be able to even run anymore.
And a lot of the ball players couldn't find places to live, and they had places out there where they could stay, and they lived there, actually, right at the camp. And the only bad part about Rockwood Lodge is they had to haul dirt in there and make a new playing field because it really was built on a rock.
He says, this field here isn't right. We're going into town, you know. That's just the way it was. And we started into town. So now we're commuting to practice from Rockwood Lodge every day. A lot of people said Lambeau burned it down, but he wasn't in town.
Later, a full-time publicist out of Chicago to replace his old and faithful ally, George Calhoun. Cal learned of his dismissal by reading it off the Press-Gazette teletype. Dismayed and deeply hurt, the patriarch of the Hungry Five became its first defector. Then came the post-war years and the emergence of the new and well-financed All-America Conference. The creation of new teams made talent scarce and very expensive. At the same time, Don Hutson, Charlie Brock, Buckets Goldenberg, and Baby Ray were bringing their careers to a close. In 1948, the Packers suffered the second losing season in their history, the first since 1933. 1949 was even worse. Gate receipts began to dwindle. So did cash reserves. The Packers were once again head-to-head with financial adversity. They had no idea, of course, that technology had even then created the force that would obliterate poverty in professional football. The crude black and white images flickering in the homes and offices of an affluent few was soon to overhaul the game's economies and bring it an opulence beyond anyone's imagination. And the sport itself, for better and for worse, would never be the same. But that approaching revolution wasn't paying any bills in the fall of 1949. So, in an effort to gain some short-term financial relief, the Packers staged a Thanksgiving Day exhibition game. Retired heroes donning Packer uniforms one last time to display for an adoring public what was left of their legendary skills. Despite a heavy snowfall that began in the early morning hours and didn't subside until kickoff time, the fans filled City Stadium and gave the Packers a $50,000 purse to use in settling some of their most pressing debts.
In those years, we were not having the greatest seasons, and I think pressures built up, and Curly had an offer from the Chicago Cardinal, and he figured that, well, forget about the pressures, and he took the Cardinal job. That's the only reason I can give.
How about you, Andy? Why do you think?
Well, I go along with Tony, too, but I thought that Curly always wanted to get a ball club of his own where he's by himself, instead of having a Hungry Five, they used to call it.
Yes. You started to control his expenses and everything else that he was doing. You see, he had a pretty free hand with running the ball club. And I think when he got pinned down...
a check cord on about that time, too.
Yeah, when they kind of pinned him down and said, well, look at, we want an accounting of what's going on with this football team, then I think that's when all the problems started.
When we decided that we would have to go out and sell some more stock and raise some more money, there was a committee appointed to structure this thing, and he told the committee, I happen to be on it, that he had 4 investors who would each put up $50,000 if we would change it to a profit-making corporation. And he was outvoted on that, and I always felt that that's really when it came to the parting of the ways, because I think he was really in it for,
1949, his contract as head coach and general manager and vice president was ending. And they had in fact, there was a meeting at the Brown County Courthouse on November 30th, 1949. I was outside, and I was a sports writer then for the Green Bay Press-Gazette, and I was waiting for the results of that meeting. It was a long and acrimonious meeting. It lasted about 5 hours. And at the conclusion of the meeting, however, Curly supposedly was offered a new 2-year contract. But the kicker there was, or the catch I should say, was that he was never physically proffered that contract. And he subsequently went to the National Football League's annual meetings in Philadelphia without a contract. And he came home as head coach and vice president of the Chicago Cardinals. And then left there and joined the Washington Redskins as head coach, and was there, I think, 2 years. But yeah, he did not have much success, except that he came back as coach of the College All-Stars in the mid-50s for 3 years. And the first game in that series, he upset the Cleveland Browns 30-27, and it was, of course, that was really Curly's last hurrah.
And a carryover from that, Charlie, was we made up our mind at that time, and it still is I think the philosophy of the officials that we would never again make the coach an officer of the club, and give him as much power as Curly had at that point.
The dawn of 1950 then found the Packers with no coach and far too many debts they had no way of paying. Once again to the rescue came Hungry Five hero Lee Joannis. He recruited quarterback Gene Ronzani to replace the departed Lambeau. Next, he accepted chairmanship of yet another stock sale committee. It was the same job he had done so brilliantly in the Depression slump of 1935. Under his leadership, the drive netted $125,000 from the sale of newly created shares, enough not only to settle all the corporation's debts, but also to create $50,000 in capital reserves and launch the Packers into the new decade under a halo of rejuvenated optimism. But it turned out to be a dismal decade, the poorest showing in the team's proud history. Coaches Ronzani, Lyle Blackburn, and Scooter McLean could combine to win only 32 games while losing 74 and tying 2. A sprinkling of star players like Tony Canadeo, Tobin Rote, Babe Pirelli, Billy Houghton, Gary Knaffel, Dave Hanner, Jim Ringo, Forrest Gregg, and Max McGee could lend luster to the Packers' struggle, but few victories. Ironically, though, it was the same decade that would encompass two of the team's greatest milestones. The first came to fruition on September 29th of 1957. As visiting celebrities, a parade of floats and marching bands through downtown, and a justifiably proud citizenry joined in celebrating the dedication of a new $1 million stadium.
We are saying this to you, that this stadium is dedicated to your entertainment. We are managing it for the citizens of Green Bay, who are the real owners of this stadium.
It was a day that had a poetically perfect ending as the Packers defeated their age-old arch rivals, the Chicago Bears, 21-17.
It's almost unbelievable. I go back, maybe 10 years when a very famous sporter in this country said that the Packers couldn't withstand it financially. And I said at that time that, in my opinion, there wouldn't be any professional football without the Packers and their tradition in Green Bay. And people of Green Bay certainly should be proud of what they've done, and the people in the National League and pro football are deeply appreciative of their wonderful spirit and what they've done for pro football.
The Packers' new home, built with financing the voters of Green Bay raised through a bond issue that passed by a 2-to-1 margin, was, like the Packer Corporation, born out of necessity. Old City Stadium seating capacity had grown from 6,000 in 1925 to 25,000 in the mid-50s, and the playing field itself maintained its reputation as one of the nation's finest. But the crude grandstands, the small East High locker room that served as common dressing quarters for both teams, the cubbyhole press box, and the absence of modern restroom accommodations rendered the proud old complex unacceptable as a playing site for teams in the National Football League. When he heard of the plans for a new city stadium, Andy Turnbull of the old Hungry Five wired a warning from his California retirement home. A stadium seating 32,500 fans would bankrupt the Packers, he said. It would simply be impossible to draw sellout crowds that large on a season ticket basis. But Andy couldn't have been expected to know what would come from the second milestone of the 1950s. It crystallized on Monday, February 2nd, 1959, with the arrival of a little-known gentleman from the East Coast who was to take over as a new Packer head coach and general manager. His name, of course, was Vincent Thomas Lombardi, and he brought with him a near mystic power.
From the time we went into our initial meeting with him, you could see and feel and sense that things were going to change. I was extremely impressed with his organization, the way he presented himself and what we were going to be doing as a team and from a philosophy standpoint.
They called another meeting of the board. I remember it was at the old Northland Hotel down there in that cafeteria. And he stood up and he said, "I want you to know that I'm in charge here."
Nobody talked back to him. He could sure put Hornig and Taylor in their place, especially Hornig and Dowler and that group. He had a great group of players, but he got the most out of them.
By only his third season, he had transformed into world champions, a team that hadn't produced a winning record in 11 long years. The glory that pervaded Packer football for its first quarter century was back. Now, though, it wasn't just a town game or a state game to be afforded prominence only on the local sports pages and among other league members. Now, it was a national media event, scrutinized by millions through the omnipresent eyes of television. As Sunday followed Sunday under Lombardi's forceful guidance, and television audiences from coast to coast looked on, new Packer legends burst into national prominence. Starr, Nitschke, Hornig, Taylor, McGee, Dowler, Ringo, Skoronsky, Gregg, Kramer, Hanner, Davis, Anderson, Wood, Dale, Adderley, Chandler, Thurston, another Kramer, Grabowski, Curry, Jordan, Kostelnik, Bowman, Robinson, Jeter, Caffey, Fleming, and on and on and on. But the most enduring legend of all was Lombardi himself. In his 9 years at the Packer helm, he won 6 division titles, 5 world championships, and the first 2 Super Bowls. His 3 consecutive world titles in 1965, 66, and 67 was a feat that had been accomplished only once before in NFL history, by the Packers of 1929, 30, and 31. Volumes have been written about how he did what he did. The men who played under him, though, were eyewitnesses to every technique, every habit, every action, and every achievement.
Yeah, I always use the word and describe him. He was an orchestrator. He took the various components of that thing and put it together. But you know, he knew just which guys needed a kick in the pants, and he knew which guys needed a pat on the shoulder and when they needed it. That's a very special talent.
I've seen in the early 60s is when a lot of first draft choices went through the Green Bay system and out the Green Bay system because they didn't fit what he needed and how he needed to motivate his people and weld them into a unit.
He was coming into a situation where we had accumulated a number of quality players. He brought in some, Willie Davis, Henry Jordan, people like that. But I think the biggest thing that we lacked at that time was a tightly knit, well-disciplined, thoroughly organized organization and an approach to winning. And he showed us where we were falling short from winning. And so the combination of the two went very well at that time.
He was a great analyzer of what was happening. He had a great program for putting together with the various groups, in our case, the offensive linemen, the offensive backs and receivers, putting together at halftime exactly what was happening and to be able to analyze it and come back in a 10-minute period with a new game plan or a change that would make us even more effective.
If you're not concerned enough with the details and the fundamentals and the techniques that are so much a part of this game, you cannot win and you won't win. And so he started over every year from ground zero.
Extremely tough. I don't know if it was his philosophy or not, but it seemed that he wanted us to practice like, and I don't know if this is what it was. He wanted us to practice like, start practice like it was the fourth quarter of a football game, and you were absolutely exhausted. And he went through those calisthenics so that in the 15 or 20 minutes that we had in them, that you were totally exhausted, and then you had to get up from there and put that hour and a half of practice in so that you knew what your body can do and you knew what your mind would do and that it wouldn't give up in this critical instance in a football game. And
practices were difficult, and they were fairly long too. He finally showed them up toward the end of the year, but and even though they were organized in time to be that way, they were good, hard, long workouts, and they got it done though. And I think when you're winning, you can accept anything, and we were winning.
With Lombardi's success, City Stadium, now Lambeau Field, mushroomed from the original 32,500 seats of 1957 to its current constantly filled capacity of over 56,000. Every seat in Milwaukee's County Stadium, the Packers' southern home field, has been sold out since 1961. And thousands of hopeful season ticket buyers throughout Wisconsin are standing by impatiently on a slowly changing waiting list. Vince Lombardi is gone now. So is Curly Lambeau, along with the Hungry Five. This franchise owns 11 National Football League championship trophies, 6 earned under Lambeau, 5 under Lombardi, an achievement unequaled by any professional football team. But the most important of all the storied legacies is the sense of tradition that permeates everything associated with Green Bay and with Packer football. A tradition of competitive excellence, of overcoming adversity, of struggling confidently against overwhelming odds, of pushing on for success when failure could easily be forgiven. In Chicago, professional football stands on the shoulders of George Halas. In New York, on Tim Maras. In Pittsburgh, Art Rooney's. In Philadelphia, Burt Bell's. In Washington, George Marshall's. In Green Bay, many feel on Lambeau's Barty's. All were great individuals who brought integrity, credibility, and worldwide stature to a sport that began as a renegade back alley entertainment. But in Wisconsin, the Packers' success has risen primarily from the ranks of the cheering faithful, from an everlasting marriage between a team and the community pride it represents, consummated by statewide investment in stock shares that have no redeemable value, will never pay a dividend, and don't even secure game tickets for its owners. The Packers are indeed the world's only Grandstand franchise.
With such country greats as the Oak Ridge Boys, Barbara Mandrell, and Hank Williams. Spend an evening in Menominee's Mabel Tainter Theater to hear the Memories in concert tonight at 10:30 on Wisconsin Public Television. Now take a trip to Margaritaville with Jimmy Buffett on Austin City Limits next.
Of Green Bay Packers, the Grandstand franchise, is made possible in part by grants from Aid Association for Lutherans, providing insurance and other fraternal benefits with headquarters in Appleton, Wisconsin. And from Kellogg Bank, Green Bay, Wisconsin, providing professional banking services for over a century.